Somewhere beneath the burning sand of Morocco, hidden inside a mountain that miners had been blasting apart for decades, something was waiting. Nobody was looking for it. Nobody expected it. But when workers cracked open a wall of rock at a place called Jebel Irhoud in 1961, they found bones, human bones. And for the next 50 years, scientists would insist those bones were wrong, not fake, not damaged. Wrong, as in they didn't fit the story we had all agreed on. Wrong, as in they threatened to rewrite the entire timeline of our species. This is the story of how a handful of skulls buried in the Sahara Desert forced scientists to admit that everything they thought they knew about the birth of humanity might have been a lie we told ourselves, because the evidence hadn't caught up yet. Let's rewind for a second, because you need to understand what human history actually meant before this discovery, so you understand exactly how much it broke when the sand gave up its secret. For most of the 20th century, the accepted story of us, Homo sapiens, modern humans, people exactly like you and me, went like this. Around 200,000 years ago, somewhere in East Africa, likely near Ethiopia, a population of early humans crossed a biological threshold. Their skulls rounded out, their faces flattened beneath bigger, more complex brains. They started behaving differently, thinking differently, maybe even dreaming differently. That, scientists said, was the birthplace of us. East Africa, 200,000 years ago. Full stop. It was in textbooks. It was in museum displays. It was practically treated as settled fact, the same way you'd treat the distance to the moon or the boiling point of water. But here's the uncomfortable truth about science that nobody tells you when you're a kid memorizing timelines for a test. Almost nothing in deep history is actually settled. It's just the best explanation available until something better, or something inconvenient, shows up and forces everyone to admit they were working with incomplete information. And in 1961, in a desert on the opposite side of the continent from where humanity was supposed to have started, something inconvenient showed up. The bones found at Jebel Irhoud were strange from the very beginning. They had features that looked almost modern, a face that could have blended into a crowd today, but a skull shape that was long and archaic, stretched out like something from a much older chapter of our story. It was as if someone had taken a modern human face and grafted it onto an ancient skull. Scientists at the time didn't know what to do with that, so they did what people often do with evidence that doesn't fit the narrative. They guessed, and they guessed wrong. Early researchers dated the remains to around 40,000 years old and labeled them as African Neanderthals, a strange offshoot that didn't really matter to the bigger picture. Case closed. Back to the East African timeline. Back to the comfortable story. Except the case wasn't closed. It just went quiet for decades. The bones sat in collections, half forgotten, mislabeled, misunderstood, while the official story of human origins kept getting repeated in classrooms and documentaries around the world. Nobody rushed back to that Moroccan mountain because nobody thought there was anything left to find. And that right there is exactly the kind of assumption the desert loves to punish. In the early 2000s, a French paleoanthropologist named Jean-Jacques Heublein decided to go back. Not because he suspected anything revolutionary, but because the original excavation had been sloppy and rushed, done by miners more interested in extracting minerals than preserving history, and Heublein wanted to see if there was anything left worth studying properly. What he and his team found over the following decade would eventually detonate one of the most confidently held assumptions in all of human science. They didn't just find a couple of old bones. They found more skull fragments, jaw bones, teeth, stone tools scattered around what looked like a hearth, a fire pit, evidence that whoever these people were, they weren't just passing through. They were living there, cooking there, surviving there, in a landscape that today is one of the most punishing deserts on Earth, but that, tens of thousands of years earlier, may have looked completely different. And using advanced dating techniques that simply didn't exist back in 1961, thermoluminescence dating on burnt flint tools found alongside the bones, the team got a number back from the lab that nobody expected. 300,000 years, not 40,000. Not somewhere around 200,000, close enough to still fit the East African story. 300,000 years old, which made these remains the oldest known fossils of our own species, Homo sapiens, discovered anywhere on the planet. And they weren't in East Africa. They were in North Africa, thousands of kilometers away, in a part of the Sahara Desert that the old textbook version of human history had essentially written off as irrelevant to our origins. Take a moment to actually sit with how big that gap is. 100,000 years. That's not a rounding error. That's not a small correction. You slip into a footnote. 100,000 years is longer than the entire span of time modern humans have supposedly existed at all, according to the old model. It's the difference between humanity being a fairly recent arrival on the evolutionary stage and humanity having deep, tangled roots stretching back far earlier and far wider across the African continent than anyone had dared to claim. And it wasn't just the date that caused problems. It was the shape of the skulls themselves. Remember how the original 1960s researchers were confused because the face looked modern but the skull looked ancient? That confusion turned out to be the whole point. These Jebel Irhoud humans had faces that would not look out of place walking down a street today, flat, delicate, unmistakably modern in structure. But their brain cases were still long and low, more like older, more primitive members of our lineage. In other words, these weren't fully modern humans in the neat, tidy sense the old timeline demanded. They were something in between, a transitional population caught in the act of becoming us. That single fact quietly demolished a huge assumption buried inside the old East African origin story. The idea that modern humans appeared quickly, almost like a switch flipping on in one location, one lucky population in one lucky valley that suddenly became us, and then spread outward to conquer the world. Jebel Irhoud suggested something far messier and, honestly, far more believable once you actually think about how evolution works. It suggested that the modern human face evolved before the modern human brain shape did, that different features of what makes us appeared at different times, in different places, and only gradually assembled into the complete package we now think of as Homo sapiens. And then there's the location itself, which might be the part of this story that unsettles people the most. Jebel Irhoud sits in Morocco, on the northwestern edge of Africa. For the old model to survive, you'd basically have to explain how a fully formed modern human population somehow ended up thousands of kilometers away from East Africa, at a date so early it predates the supposed birthplace of the species by 100,000 years. That doesn't fit a simple story of humanity starting in one Garden of Eden and spreading outward like ripples in a pond. It fits a much stranger, much bigger picture. One where early populations of proto-modern humans were scattered across enormous stretches of the African continent simultaneously, interbreeding, separating, evolving in parallel, exchanging genes and traits across distances that we used to assume were far too vast for ancient humans to bridge. Which brings us to the second half of this mystery, because bones alone don't explain how anyone could have been living comfortably in the middle of what is now one of the most lethal environments on Earth. The Sahara today is brutal. It's the largest hot desert on the planet, roughly the size of the entire United States, a place where daytime temperatures regularly punish anything that dares to move without shade or water. It should be the last place on Earth you'd expect to find a thriving ancient human settlement, let alone one that might represent a critical branch point in our species' evolution. But here's where the story gets even stranger and even more real, because this isn't speculation. It's backed by an enormous body of independent evidence collected from soil cores, cave paintings, fossilized pollen, and ancient lake beds buried under the dunes. The Sahara has not always been a desert, far from it. Multiple times throughout Earth's climate history, shifts in the planet's orbit changed how sunlight hit North Africa, triggering what scientists now call green Sahara periods, also known as the African humid period. During these windows, which could last for thousands of years at a time, the Sahara transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Grasslands, shallow lakes, rivers cutting channels through what is now barren rock, forests in places where today you'd struggle to find a single blade of grass for hundreds of miles. Rock art discovered deep in the Sahara, in places like the Tassili Niger Plateau in Algeria, shows exactly this lost world. Painted directly onto cave walls by ancient people are images of swimming figures, herds of cattle, giraffes, hippos, crocodiles, animals that require significant water and vegetation to survive, animals you would never associate with sand dunes, all depicted by human hands, living right there in what is now empty desert. These aren't myths or legends passed down through oral tradition. These are physical, dated, scientifically verified artworks, confirming that people once lived alongside lakes and rivers in a Sahara that was green, fertile, and teeming with life. So when you put these two threads together, the discovery of proto-modern humans at Jebel Irhoud dating back 300,000 years, and the independently confirmed fact that the Sahara has cycled between lush, livable green savanna and lethal desert multiple times throughout deep history, the picture starts to make a very different kind of sense. It's entirely plausible and increasingly supported by evidence that the Sahara wasn't some empty wasteland during the earliest chapters of human evolution. It may have been a crucial, thriving corridor, a place where different early human populations met, mixed, competed, and evolved, hidden from the historical record for so long simply because the desert eventually swallowed the evidence beneath centuries of shifting sand. And that idea alone forces us to rethink another core assumption buried inside the old story of human origins, the assumption that our species evolved in a single, isolated location and then marched outward from there like an army with a single starting point on a map. What Jebel Irhoud suggests instead is something scientists now call the Pan-African origin model. Instead of one Garden of Eden, Imagine a patchwork of early human populations scattered across the entire African continent, from Morocco in the north to South Africa in the south, from the Horn of Africa in the east, each group evolving somewhat independently in response to their own environments, but never fully isolated, migrating along green corridors when the climate allowed it, meeting other groups, exchanging genes, tools, ideas, and culture across a landscape that occasionally, cyclically, opened up and connected them all. Under this model, the Sahara isn't some irrelevant footnote to human evolution stuck out on the margins of the real story happening in East Africa. It's potentially one of the central stages where the drama played out, a crossroads, a meeting point. And the fossils at Jebel Irhoud might just be one surviving fragment of a much larger, much older network of early human life that mostly got erased by time, sand, and the sheer brutal patience of desert erosion. Now, it's worth being honest about what science can and cannot claim here, because this is where a lot of documentaries get sloppy and start exaggerating for views. The Jebel Irhoud discovery does not prove that all modern humans descend directly and exclusively from this one Moroccan population. Genetic studies suggest our species' story is more tangled than any single site can tell. What Jebel Irhoud does prove, beyond reasonable scientific doubt, is that populations bearing many of the hallmark features of modern humans existed in North Africa 100,000 years earlier than the old textbook timeline allowed, and in a location the old model had essentially dismissed. That is not a small correction. That is a fundamental crack in a story that had been repeated with total confidence for over half a century. It also raises questions that scientists still can't fully answer, and that, honestly, is part of what makes this so unsettling and so fascinating at the same time. If humans capable of surviving in the Sahara existed 300,000 years ago, what happened to them when the climate shifted and the desert swallowed their homeland again? Did they migrate south, back toward the populations we traditionally associate with human origins? Did they die out entirely, an evolutionary dead end lost to sand and time? Or did their genes persist, quietly diffuse through later populations, in ways our current genetic tools still struggle to detect? Nobody knows for certain. And in a strange way, that uncertainty is the most honest, most human part of this entire story. We like to imagine science as a straight line marching confidently toward complete knowledge. The truth is messier. Every so often, the ground literally opens up beneath our assumptions, and we're forced to admit that the map we've been using was drawn with far less information than we thought we had. What makes Jebel Irhoud even more remarkable is what it tells us about the people themselves, not just their bones, but their behavior. Alongside the skeletal remains, researchers found stone tools crafted using a sophisticated technique called Levallois flaking, a method that requires real planning, real foresight, chipping away at a stone core in a specific, controlled sequence to eventually strike off a sharp, usable blade in one clean motion. This wasn't crude, accidental toolmaking. This was skill passed down, taught, refined over generations. There was also evidence of controlled fire use, hearths where these ancient people cooked, gathered, maybe even told stories under the desert stars, in a Sahara that at the time might have offered shade, water, and game animals instead of endless dunes. Some of the animal bones found at the site show cut marks consistent with butchery, meaning these people were skilled, deliberate hunters, not simply scavengers, picking over the leftovers of larger predators. Put it all together, the toolmaking, the fire, the hunting, the nearly modern faces staring out from ancient, elongated skulls, and you get a picture of a population that was already remarkably capable, remarkably close to us in behavior, hundreds of thousands of years before the old timeline said any of that should have been possible in this part of the world. So when people say scientists found something in the Sahara Desert that doesn't match human history, understand what that actually means, because it's not aliens. It's not some impossible artifact. It's something arguably more disorienting than either of those. It's proof, hard, dated, physically verified proof, that the story we told ourselves about where we come from and when we became us was simply incomplete, not fabricated, not a conspiracy, just incomplete, the way every human understanding of deep history eventually turns out to be incomplete, right up until the desert decides to give up another piece of the puzzle. And that's really the most haunting part of standing in a place like Jebel Irhoud, or looking at rock art of swimming humans and grazing hippos painted onto stone in the middle of what is now one of the driest places on Earth. The ground beneath the Sahara isn't empty. It's not just sand stretching endlessly toward the horizon. It's layer after layer of forgotten chapters, forgotten climates, forgotten populations of people who lived, hunted, made tools, raised children, and eventually vanished beneath dust that took hundreds of thousands of years to finish falling. We assumed the story of humanity had a single clean starting point, because that's the story that was easiest to tell. The Sahara suggests otherwise. It suggests our origins are wider, older, messier, and far more scattered across this continent than anyone confidently claimed just a few decades ago. And if one desert, one mountainside that miners almost destroyed by accident, was capable of rewriting 100,000 years of accepted human history, you have to wonder what else is still buried out there, waiting under the next dune, for someone to finally go back and look again.